Mr. Ebele Okeke is a real multi-sector investment tycoon with an incomparable expertise in doing business in Africa. First as head of commodity investor solutions at Lehman Brothers for commodity derivatives in Africa, Middle East and Europe, then at Standard Chartered Bank as director of corporate and community Sub-Sahara Africa clients, then as division head of Sub-Sahara Africa commodities and securities for Goldman Sachs, then at Credit Suisse as head of Sub-Saharan Africa cross-asset origination and investment banking, and since 2 years, Ebele is the managing director of Altica Partners, a leading Africa-focused multi-sector investment and risk advisory company. But more than this, since 8 years, Ebele is based in Dubai, and therefore he is the right person to talk about Dubai as a hub for African business. Please.
Thank you, Stefan. I know it's quite late in the afternoon, so I'll try and make it a little bit brief. Just to give you a little bit of overview about Altica Partners and what we do. So we are an Africa-focused investment firm. Although we're also doing advisory now, we're an Africa-focused investment and advisory firm. We are in the IFC, regulated by the DFSA. I believe I've been told we're probably the only regulated Africa-focused investment and advisory firm in the Middle East. I'm not sure, I may be wrong on that one. Effectively, what we do is that we originally were set up to channel capital from the Middle East into Sub-Saharan Africa. And the way we do that is through our vehicle called Altica Credit, which basically has two funds. The first fund deploys capital, typically between 3 to 25 million into Sub-Saharan Africa medium-sized businesses. The thinking is that if you give these companies credit and you give them the expertise, they grow and they can become the next big champions and big multinationals for Africa. The other fund, which is a newer fund, is a fixed income fund because, I mean, if you go to any of your bank, I don't know if you talk to any of your UAE banks, I very much doubt you have an Africa fund on their platform. So we saw a niche there and an opportunity for Africa to be represented in the investment community here. We also do a little bit of risk advisory, which is a lot what's been talked about today around risk management, worrying about currency fluctuations, commodities due diligence. But also we can also do all the other things around capital raising equity and raising debt, and so on, which most of other advisory firms do. The difference is we only take on a few clients at a certain one time, and we are purely Sub-Saharan Africa focused. Special situations is kind of a niche business. We found that everything in Africa is either very, very easy or very, very complex. So very, very complex is where it goes into special situations, where we're mixing a variety of different financing plus derivatives and structures in there to try and get a solution for a particular market, a particular problem. The purpose of this presentation is really about, I'm going to give it to you from our perspective as to why Dubai makes sense for Africa as a hub. I mean, the UAE, going back, potentially hundreds of years, if you look at not just the UAE, but you look at Oman especially, has always had a very strong relationship with the Middle East, with Africa, I should say. If you dig deep, you actually find that a lot of UAE businesses are already active in Africa. I mean, those of us here know how easy it is to fly to Africa from here with Emirates, Fly Dubai, Air Arabia. If you're going to South Africa, you have about 8 flights a day. From here to South Africa, Nigeria, you have about 4 flights. Kenya, Kenya, Ethiopia, it's almost like a bus service. You miss one, you get yourself on the next one. You can't really do that physically in London, where you often have to change to Paris or to Amsterdam or to Portugal to change flights. So logistically, it makes sense. So as a result, there have been a whole bunch of UAE businesses who've already set foot in Africa. And these are the more popular ones. And then you have the facilitators. I should probably have Berkeley on here as well. But if you look at, there isn't enough going on. If you move away from the top, the high-level big deals. Every week, if you see in the news and the newspaper, there's always an African president or a whole bunch of African ministers that come to Dubai. They take nice pictures with some of the rulers. And that happens at sort of the G2G level, the government level. But what needs to be energized as the private sector is the level below that. So the SME businesses, the other businesses who are looking to enter Africa, and also those African businesses that actually want to access the GCC markets. So in terms of trade, UAE is very strong on trade. There's been a lot of investments going in. You have a lot of African sovereign, UAE sovereign businesses putting money into Africa. You have all I'll pretty much say almost the top 5 UAE banks already have or are seriously thinking of executing an Africa strategy. FAB is already active, Mashrek is active. I know ADCB is thinking about something. Everybody knows that the UAE, we even talk to Egyptian and Moroccan firms, and they are finding the MENA region is already saturated. So they're thinking, the only way to go is to go south and to find opportunities there. And the best place so far to do all of this has been from Dubai. When we looked at this region, and we looked at how could we cover the financial sector properly, and we found out that Dubai and the DIFC, and alongside I would say ADGM, which is a newer free zone, are really the best conduits or the best locations for doing business here, and that's why when we actually think about it. There's so few Africa financial firms. A lot of the banks that you see advertising on CNN, African banks and so on, a few of them here. And it would make a lot more sense for them to have their hubs here, because what we've seen is a lot of Chinese banks have now set up in the DIFC. The Japanese banks have set up as well. There's a lot of trade finance. A lot of Africa trade finance actually flows through here into Africa. So we see that, there's really no reason why we can't have an African company listed on NASDAQ Dubai. If you look at the rules for NASDAQ Dubai, it actually allows for an African company to list. But you'll find a lot of African companies actually, once they start thinking about their local exchange, they start thinking about Johannesburg or they think about the London Stock Exchange. If we had more representation of African companies on the Dubai Stock Exchange, then maybe there will be some allocation from Saudi investors and all the GCC investors into African companies. So what we decided to do in Africa is to try and bring the best of Africa to the UAE and to the GCC. So we spend a lot of time screening and going through hundreds and hundreds of companies on a weekly basis, trying to pick out the companies that obviously are financially sound, that we can invest in and make a profit and make a return from them. But also we look at companies that can make an impact in their local company, in their local environment, and to create jobs and create a better life. But the number one thing we look at when we look at any company in Africa is, how do we use our presence and our hub in Dubai as an advantage for this company? What I mean is, let me give you a few examples. So we looked at a company recently that is a pharmaceutical manufacturer in Kenya, and they make generic drugs. Some of you may know who I'm talking about. And they've kind of done the East African market pretty well. The next step is to export to Ghana. They want to export to Ghana. They want to export to Nigeria. If you're in Europe, all you just have to do is put your stuff in a cooled container and truck it or put it on a railway line all the way out from East Africa to West Africa. But actually, the only sensible way to do this right now is to put your cargo on Emirates Cargo, fly it over to Dubai, and actually split it into pieces and redistribute it back to Africa. Now, I mean, so it's a little bit disappointing that's the way to do it, but actually that's the most efficient way to do it until the Africa infrastructure catches up with those kind of intra-Africa trade problems. That's one example. Other examples we see, especially in agriculture, where you see, you see a rose farm in Kenya, or we saw a blueberry farm in Zambia that grows blueberry and flies them all the way to Asda in the UK. We spoke to the CEO and said, why don't you sell it to Carrefour in the Middle East? You have Carrefour, that's probably the largest purchaser of blueberries in this part of the world, and it was an opportunity to them. They never thought about it. The pricing is better, the logistical costs are lower, and the products actually arrive quicker, and they arrive safer. So every time we look at a company, we think, how can the GCC be an advantage for this company? And then other things around, it's something I wrote here in green, which is just the cost of doing business within Africa. So we all know from here, if anyone here who's based in Dubai, we know how hard it is to make a call from Dubai into any African country. Now, I don't know how many of you have actually been in, say, Ghana or Nigeria, and you try and call someone in Botswana, or you try and call someone do a conference call with people in Rwanda or Uganda. It's actually, it can be quite challenging and quite frustrating just because of the infrastructural problems. Now, we have to invest and push the infrastructure forward, but there's nothing wrong in the meantime to actually use what the UAE and the GCC have created here to accelerate our growth and accelerate trade in the short to medium time span. So I think that's something that a lot of African companies should see to their advantage and try and leverage that already. One of the other things which we spend a lot of time on is the credit gap. When I say credit gap, it is if I'm sure all of us in this room have come across, if we don't own an African business, have come across an African business that needs capital and needs capital to grow. There have been billions of dollars raised by African private equity firms to invest into Africa, and I think it was Linda that said earlier on that how many African companies are willing to take $10 million just like that as equity. But I actually say a lot of these PE firms, the Blackstones and the Carlyles and so on, the reason that they're frustrated and some of them are pulling out is because they're trying to deploy $50 million at once into African companies. There are not that many African companies that can take $50 million. And even those that, if you own an African business, whatever sector it is, whether it be pharmaceutical, whether it be healthcare, whether it be manufacturing, once you've been told all the demographic statistics that Africa is going to grow and grow and grow and the population is going to increase, why would you sell an equity stake right now? You'd want to hold on to your equity for as long as you can, rather than giving up a majority stake to a business. So actually what we found is a lot of African companies need debt and need credits to grow. And they need different types of credits, and often when they go to an African bank, the bank just says, look, if you're not going to give me collateral, you're not going to give me, in oil and gas or mining and so on, or if the ticket size is too small, we just don't understand it, so we're not going to finance you. Now, using Dubai as a hub, we're sitting here and we have access to, all the capital in the GCC, plus the capital that comes from China, from Japan, don't forget Russia, the CIS. All of that capital can be put to work in small ticket sizes into Sub-Saharan Africa. So anyone who's typically looking, if you go to Abidjan or you go to Dakar, when they're looking for capital, the first thing they do is they fly to Paris. You go to Lagos and Accra, the first thing they do is they fly to London. But actually, what you should do is to have a stopover with Emirates, talk to people here before you get to London. And people often, it's not an easy sell, obviously, but there are opportunities. And if you do your work, you'll be able to get financing. We're in Brexit territory. Everyone's talking about Brexit, at least in Europe. Everyone knows about Expo 2020 here. We know a lot of the challenges that businesses in Europe, especially Africa-related businesses in Europe, may face when Brexit happens, especially those of them in the financial institutions. So we see that there's an opportunity right now for the UAE and this region to really take charge and seize this opportunity to have Dubai or the UAE as a hub for Africa business. We've got all these different free zones, which, as I said, when we look at a company, we instantly think, what free zone would make sense for them? How could we accelerate their trade? How could we make them a little bit more, we often say we're preparing companies for their wedding. So we know that in 3 to 5 years, you look attractive to a massive private equity or a massive investor. So what we do is we look at a company, we think about how it could work and how using the UAE as a hub could make things better. Once we inject capital into them, then over the period of time, once they grow and they get to a certain size, then they can sell a minority stake in their business if they choose to. So we see the infrastructure that the UAE has put together as very critical. You'll find a lot of people flying over here on holidays and so on easily. It's easy for most African countries to get a visa over to Dubai, as opposed to if anyone here has an African passport and is trying to get a Schengen visa, I think you understand and appreciate what I'm saying. My last slide, which is actually what I see as probably the most interesting slide to me, is just about practicality. How do you get a small company? If you look at the blue box on the left-hand side, how do you move a small African company from that side all the way to to sort of what you call an African champion, which will attract public investors? When we started off this journey, I met a gentleman, a retired ex-banker from Merrill Lynch, who said to me, Ebele, you're never going to get GCC investors to put money directly into an African company. You need to do what we did in China back in the 90s. Now, if you think about China in the 1990s, a lot of Chinese companies, medium-sized Chinese companies, were growing, and they were looking for dollars. They were looking for foreign currency to grow, because they wanted to expand their businesses, they wanted to export, and so on. Now, what some clever people did was actually went around and looked at the Chinese market and picked out the very best Chinese companies, knowing fully well that nobody was going to invest directly into a Chinese company back in the 1990s, but rather pick out these companies and bring them to Hong Kong and set them up under Hong Kong law, which was basically British law, and have those guys and have those companies then interface with international investors and raise capital. You won't be surprised to hear that some of those companies who moved to Hong Kong are now dual listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So when we look at this map here, this is a kind of a roadmap for what we are trying to do at Untitled, which is on the left-hand side, inject capital, and not just capital, also a bit of expertise into these companies. These companies move one step to the right. Maybe they set up a company here, maybe they don't. And then they use the benefits. So I was talking about the healthcare company. You could use the Dubai Healthcare City. You could use the Dubai Airport Free Zone. You use your banks, all the different banks for trade finance. You use Emirates Cargo, you use Etihad Cargo. And you use all these things to facilitate your business within and also outside Africa. There's no rule that if you're, we came across a company that evacuates expatriates from Africa out. And the CEO said to me, look, why am I still an African company? Because if I have an Australian who breaks his leg on a mine and I need to fly them back to Australia, what I'm doing right now is I'm flying them to Dubai and leaving them to an Australian company to move them all the way there. Whereas what I could do is actually, if I set up my hub in Dubai, I can actually carry my Australian patient all the way to Australia, as opposed to just, and I earn foreign currency, and that foreign currency comes back to my African company. So using Dubai as a hub is really a no-brainer for many of these businesses. Moving on, so once these companies get to a certain size, you'll find out that suddenly the bigger names start getting interested. You're not going to go to Mubadala with a company that's at sales of $3 million or $5 million. They're looking for bigger tickets. And when you get to that size, then you can then leverage the sovereign and the larger institutional money to move on to the next step. And the final step would be, potentially, an IPO. And there's really no reason why in the next few years we shouldn't see Africa-related IPOs on the Dubai Stock Exchange. So that's our roadmap, and that's kind of a summary of how we've seen Africa, mostly medium-sized African businesses, use the UAE and Dubai as a hub to grow. That concludes it. Thank you very much.